Humans are the only species on this planet that can reshape continents, alter the climate, erase other species from existence, and imagine futures that do not yet exist. And yet, when a human life begins, it begins in a state of extreme helplessness, a condition so fragile that survival is impossible without constant care from others. A human newborn cannot walk, cannot cling, cannot feed itself, cannot flee, cannot defend, and cannot survive alone, even for a single day, while many animals born on the same planet enter the world already prepared for life. A foal can stand within minutes, a deer can run within hours, a bird instinctively knows how to beg for food, and countless species arrive equipped with the basic tools needed to stay alive. From the very first moment, humans are different, not because they are stronger, but because they are weaker than almost everything else. This creates a disturbing paradox that the human mind struggles to resolve. How did the species that would eventually dominate Earth begin life as the most dependent, vulnerable, and unfinished creature of all? If intelligence is supposed to be an advantage, why does it come paired with such profound fragility at birth? If evolution rewards survival, why does it produce offspring that cannot survive on their own? At first glance, this looks like a flaw, as if nature made a mistake, as if humans were released into the world before they were ready, incomplete and exposed. Yet this helplessness is not accidental, and it is not rare. Every civilization, every empire, every scientist, every leader, every thinker, every artist, all began the same way. Unable to move, unable to speak, unable to survive without the protection of others. This fact quietly connects all of humanity across time, but it is also deeply unsettling, because it suggests that weakness is not a temporary phase that we outgrow, but something embedded at the very core of what it means to be human. Even as adults, humans remain more dependent than most species, relying on social structures, shared knowledge, emotional bonds, and collective systems to function. The helplessness of birth does not fully disappear. It simply changes shape, and this raises a question that is difficult to sit with, a question that slowly exhausts the mind the longer it is held. What if human power did not emerge despite this weakness, but because of it? What if the same condition that leaves us defenseless at birth is also the condition that shaped our brains, our societies, our emotions, and our endless need for connection? Before strength, before intelligence, before control, there is helplessness. And every human life begins inside that quiet, vulnerable truth. Human helplessness at birth is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a measurable biological condition that places human newborns at the absolute extreme end of dependency among mammals. At birth, the human nervous system is so underdeveloped that basic motor control is almost non-existent, with muscles unable to coordinate even the simplest actions required for survival. A newborn cannot support its own head because the neck muscles are not yet strong enough, the motor neurons are still forming connections, and the brain has not completed the circuits necessary for controlled movement. Breathing, heart rate, and digestion function automatically, but nearly everything else depends on external regulation. Body temperature fluctuates dangerously without constant warmth, blood sugar levels can drop rapidly without regular feeding, and the immune system is immature, leaving the infant vulnerable to infections that other species are better equipped to resist. In contrast, many mammals are born with functioning motor systems that allow immediate interaction with their environment. Even species that require parental care are capable of basic movement, reflexive escape responses, and rudimentary coordination. Human infants lack all of these. From a survival standpoint, this is not just weakness, it is a complete absence of autonomy. The environment does not forgive this kind of vulnerability. Cold, hunger, dehydration, and predators do not pause for development. And yet, humans are born as if the environment has been temporarily suspended. This places an extraordinary burden on caregivers, because survival is no longer an individual biological process, but a collective one. The infant's body alone is insufficient. It requires constant human presence. From an evolutionary perspective, this is a dangerous gamble. Any species that cannot protect its young independently risks extinction when conditions become unstable. Food shortages, disease, social disruption, or loss of caregivers would have wiped out early human populations repeatedly. Generation after generation, humans continue to be born unfinished. The persistence of this trait forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable idea. Helplessness was not eliminated because it was not selected against. Instead, it coexisted with survival, suggesting that whatever humans gained later in life was valuable enough to justify extreme vulnerability at the beginning. This shifts the question away from how weak human infants are toward why such weakness was tolerated at all. If survival was the only measure, humans should never have made it. Yet they did, not because infants were strong, but because the social structure surrounding them compensated for what biology withheld. And this compensation was not optional, it was mandatory. Human survival began not in the body, but in the presence of others, embedding dependence into the species from the very first breath. When this biological helplessness is placed side by side with other species, the contrast becomes so extreme that it stops feeling natural and begins to feel wrong. As if humans exist outside the usual rules that govern life. Most mammals are born with nervous systems that are already calibrated for the environment they enter. Their muscles respond predictably, their reflexes activate instantly, and their bodies contain built-in instructions for survival. A newborn calf knows how to stand. A puppy can crawl toward warmth. A chimpanzee infant, despite requiring care, can cling to its mother's body with enough strength to stay attached while she moves. These abilities are not learned. They are present at birth. Human infants, however, are born without such guarantees. Their grasp reflex exists, but it is weak and unreliable. Their movements are chaotic, uncoordinated, and largely meaningless. Even their cries, which signal distress, are not problem-solving tools but alarms that require interpretation by others. Biologically speaking, the human newborn does not interact with the environment in a functional way. It merely reacts. This is important, because survival in nature favors action over reaction. Species that hesitate, freeze, or wait for assistance do not last long. Yet humans begin life entirely in waiting mode, suspended in a prolonged developmental delay that has no parallel in most of the animal kingdom. This delay is not measured in days or weeks, but in years. Human children take far longer to walk, feed themselves, regulate emotions, and recognize danger than nearly all other species. From birth onward, development unfolds slowly, almost painfully slowly, as if evolution deliberately pressed the pause button on independence. This extended helplessness increases risk at every stage. A dependent infant limits mobility, demands constant attention, and drains resources. In harsh environments, such traits should be punished by natural selection. And yet, they were not. This forces the realization that humans did not survive despite this prolonged vulnerability, but alongside it. The human body seems to outsource survival during early life to something beyond biology alone. Strength is replaced by care. Reflex is replaced by guidance. The infant does not adapt to the environment. The environment adapts to the infant. Shelters are built, fires are maintained, food is prepared, dangers are anticipated. Survival becomes a shared responsibility rather than an individual one. This marks a radical departure from how life usually operates. In most species, the body is the primary survival tool. In humans, the body at birth is insufficient. It requires a social buffer to remain alive. This is not a small detail. It is a defining feature. The human species effectively bet its survival on cooperation, patience, and long-term investment. That bet could have failed countless times, yet it did not. This suggests that helplessness was not merely tolerated, but integrated into the human survival strategy. The cost was enormous, but so was whatever benefit followed. And this brings the discomfort back again, because it implies that the human body was never meant to stand alone. From the very beginning, survival was conditional. The helpless newborn is not an exception to the human story. It is the opening statement. The deeper this biological reality is examined, the clearer it becomes that human helplessness at birth is not simply about weak muscles or poor coordination, but about a developmental strategy that delays completion itself. Human infants are born with brains that are structurally incomplete, with neural pathways still forming at a rapid pace after birth. At the moment of delivery, a large portion of the brain's wiring has not yet been finalized, particularly in regions responsible for higher cognition, emotional regulation, and complex motor planning. This means that a human infant is not just physically unfinished, but neurologically unfinished as well. In most species, critical brain development happens before birth, ensuring that offspring enter the world with a functional set of survival tools. Humans reverse this pattern. They externalize brain development, continuing it outside the womb in full exposure to the world. This creates a dangerous gap between biological need and biological capacity. The infant requires constant stimulation, protection, and regulation precisely because its brain cannot yet perform these functions internally. Hunger, fear, and discomfort overwhelm the system easily. Every stressor becomes amplified. Crying is not a choice. It is the only available output. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is a fragile design. A brain that is still under construction is vulnerable to damage, deprivation, and error. Malnutrition, neglect, or instability during this period can permanently alter development. Other species minimize this risk by completing critical growth before birth. Humans accept the risk and extend development into the external world. This suggests that the environment itself became part of the developmental process. Human infants are shaped not only by biology, but by the conditions they are born into, the care they receive, the voices they hear, the rhythms they experience. Helplessness creates openness. Because the brain is unfinished, it is highly adaptable, capable of absorbing vast amounts of information and adjusting to a wide range of environments. But adaptability comes at a cost. Before learning can occur, survival must be guaranteed by others. The infant cannot choose what it is exposed to, cannot escape harmful conditions, cannot correct mistakes. It absorbs everything indiscriminately. This makes early life both a window of extraordinary potential and extreme vulnerability. Evolution appears to have accepted this risk in exchange for flexibility, trading early competence for long-term adaptability. The helpless body becomes a platform for learning rather than action. Instinct is reduced, leaving space for culture, language, and social rules to fill the gap. But until that gap is filled, the infant remains defenseless. This prolonged dependency is not an accident of modern life. It existed in ancient environments where threats were constant and margins for error were thin. The fact that such a strategy survived suggests that human groups compensated aggressively for individual weakness. Care was not optional. It was enforced by necessity. Helplessness forced proximity, prolonged bonding, and repeated interaction. It made isolation lethal and connection essential. Long before humans understood this consciously, their biology ensured it. The newborn's weakness quietly dictated the structure of human life, shaping families, communities, and social behavior around the demands of an unfinished being. And in doing so, it embedded dependency so deeply into the human condition that it could never be fully removed later in life. When all of these biological facts are placed together, the picture that emerges is not one of accidental weakness, but of a species whose survival strategy begins with exposure rather than protection. Human infants are born into the world before they are biologically ready, carrying bodies that cannot act and brains that cannot yet regulate themselves and this creates a state of total reliance that no other dominant species tolerates to the same degree. From the first breath, survival is no longer an individual achievement, but a negotiated outcome, dependent on the presence, attention, and consistency of others. This is a radical inversion of how life usually operates. In most species, independence appears early and social bonds form later. In humans, social bonds must exist first, or independence never arrives. The helplessness of the newborn therefore acts as a biological demand placed on the group, forcing cooperation, patience, and long-term investment. Without these, the species collapses. This means that human biology quietly selected for social reliability rather than individual strength. Groups that could not protect their weakest members disappeared, while those that could endure prolonged dependency survived. Over time, this reshaped not just behavior, but values, instincts, and emotional wiring. Attachment, empathy, and sensitivity to distress became survival tools, not moral luxuries. The infant's inability to survive alone ensured that isolation was deadly and connection was essential. This reframes helplessness as a filter, rather than a flaw. It eliminated forms of human organization that could not sustain care, and rewarded those that could. However, this also left a permanent mark on the species. A body that begins life-dependent never fully forgets that condition. Even as adults, humans remain unusually sensitive to abandonment, rejection, and instability. The early reliance on others does not vanish. It echoes forward into emotional life, shaping fear, attachment, and the need for belonging. What begins as biological helplessness slowly transforms into psychological vulnerability. And this transformation is not a side effect, but a continuation of the same developmental path. The human body never becomes fully self-sufficient in the way other species do. It trades certainty for flexibility, autonomy for connection. At birth, this trade is brutal and absolute. Later, it becomes subtle and internalized. But the foundation is the same. The human story does not begin with strength, speed, or instinct. It begins with exposure, reliance, and the silent requirement that someone else must care enough for survival to continue. This is the raw biological truth of being human, and it is deeply uncomfortable because it suggests that dependence is not something we temporarily outgrow, but something that shaped us from the very beginning and never truly leaves. When human helplessness is compared directly with other species, the difference is not a matter of degree but of category, as if humans are playing a different evolutionary game altogether. In most animals, birth marks the transition from protection to participation. The offspring enters the world already equipped with a functional relationship to its environment. Movement may be clumsy, strength may be limited, but the basic contract is clear. The body can do something. It can move towards safety, cling to a parent, follow a herd, or respond to danger in a way that increases survival. Even animals that require extended care are rarely useless. A chimpanzee infant, often cited as dependent, can grip its mother's fur with a strength that allows her to travel freely. A kangaroo joey, though tiny, instinctively crawls into the pouch on its own. These are not learned behaviors. They are built-in solutions. Humans, by contrast, are born without such solutions. A human infant cannot cling reliably, cannot follow, cannot orient itself towards safety. Its limbs move, but without purpose. Its senses receive input, but without interpretation. If left unattended, the body does not compensate. It fails. This is not because humans are more complex, but because complexity has not yet arrived. At birth, the human infant does not possess the traits that define the species later in life. Intelligence, language, foresight, and self-control are absent. What exists instead is raw potential, suspended inside a body that cannot act on its own behalf. This makes human birth uniquely exposed. Other species arrive with instructions already installed, Humans arrive with space, where instructions will eventually be written. This gap between arrival and readiness is the core of the comparison, and it is unsettling because it reverses expectations. The more advanced the species becomes, the less prepared it seems at the start. Instead of being born stronger, humans are born weaker. Instead of being born more capable, they are born more dependent. This inversion challenges the assumption that evolution moves toward immediate efficiency. In humans, efficiency is postponed. Survival is deferred. The body waits, and during that waiting period, the environment must change to accommodate the infant. Rather than the infant adapting to the environment, fire must be kept burning, shelters must be maintained, food must be softened and delivered, threats must be anticipated. The infant does nothing to earn this protection. It simply exists. In evolutionary terms, this is an enormous cost. Every dependent infant slows the group, increases risk, and demands resources that could otherwise be used for survival. Yet humans continue down this path, deepening dependency rather than reducing it. This suggests that the comparison with other species is not meant to highlight human failure, but human divergence. Humans did not optimize for early competence. They optimized for something that comes later. But before that, later advantage appears. The comparison is brutal. Against the natural world, the human newborn is defenseless, unfinished, and completely outmatched. And this reality forces the mind to confront a quiet contradiction. The species that would eventually dominate its environment begins life unable to meet it at all. Looking more closely at animal birth exposes how unusual the human condition truly is, because in most species, helplessness is carefully limited, contained within narrow boundaries that do not threaten survival. Even animals that are classified as altricial, meaning they are born requiring care, still possess immediate functional abilities that anchor them to life. Newborn birds may be blind and featherless, yet they instinctively lift their heads and open their mouths at the correct moment. Puppies are uncoordinated, but they can crawl toward warmth and latch onto their mother without instruction. These small competencies are not trivial. They are survival anchors. Humans lack even these. A human infant cannot move toward warmth intentionally, cannot seek food, cannot attach itself securely, and cannot regulate distress without external intervention. The body does not guide the infant towards survival. It simply signals discomfort. This creates a situation in which survival depends entirely on interpretation by others. Crying must be understood, hunger must be recognized, danger must be anticipated before it is perceived. In other species, the offspring participates in its own survival from the beginning. In humans, survival is delegated outward. This delegation is risky because it introduces uncertainty. Care can fail. Attention can lapse. Resources can disappear. From a biological perspective, removing the infant from active participation should reduce survival rates dramatically. And yet, humans did not just survive, they expanded. This paradox becomes sharper when considering how long human dependency lasts. In many species, helplessness is brief. Within days or weeks, mobility improves and autonomy increases. In humans, dependence stretches across years. Walking takes months. Self-feeding takes years. Emotional regulation takes decades. The comparison reveals that human development is not just slow, but elongated beyond what seems reasonable for survival. This extended delay forces prolonged interaction between generations. Parents must invest energy, time, and attention far beyond what is required in most species. This investment reshapes behavior. Humans become attentive, watchful, emotionally responsive. The needs of the helpless infant reorganize adult priorities. Sleep is disrupted. Movement is constrained. Risk tolerance decreases. The presence of a dependent infant alters the entire structure of daily life. No other species is altered so deeply, for so long, by the needs of its young. This suggests that human helplessness is not an accidental byproduct of intelligence, but a mechanism that binds individuals together over extended periods. By comparison, animals that gain independence quickly can disperse sooner, reducing long-term dependency. Humans cannot. The comparison, therefore, reveals a fundamental trade. Humans sacrifice early autonomy to force prolonged social cohesion. Helplessness becomes a tool, not of individual survival, but of group formation. Through comparison, it becomes clear that human infancy is not simply weaker, but differently designed, structured to ensure that survival occurs inside relationships rather than outside them. Another way to understand the contrast between humans and other species is to look at what happens when care is briefly removed. In the natural world, many newborn animals possess a margin of error. If a parent is distracted, delayed, or temporarily absent, the offspring can often endure. It may remain still, conserve energy, or move toward a safer position. The body provides a buffer against short-term failure. Human infants do not have this buffer. Even brief lapses in care can become life-threatening. Dehydration, hypothermia, or suffocation can occur quickly, not because the environment is hostile, but because the infant cannot respond to it. This lack of margin reveals how little redundancy exists in the human survival system at birth. The body alone offers almost no protection. Everything depends on continuity of care. This stands in sharp contrast to most species, where biology provides multiple layers of defense. Reflexes, instincts, and mobility act as backups when care fails. Humans outsource all of this. The comparison becomes even more stark when considering how animals learn. In many species, learning refines existing instincts. A young animal practices skills it already possesses. Humans do the opposite. Learning replaces instinct almost entirely. The infant does not refine, it constructs. This means there is nothing to fall back on in the early stages. Mistakes are not corrected internally. They must be prevented externally. This places enormous pressure on caregivers and the social environment. Failure is catastrophic, not instructional. In other species, failure often teaches. In humans, failure often kills. This changes the role of learning itself. Learning cannot be trial and error. It must be guided, protected, and scaffolded. The environment becomes padded, simplified, and controlled. Over time, this produces a developmental trajectory that is deeply social. Knowledge is transferred deliberately, not discovered accidentally. The infant absorbs patterns, rhythms, and behaviors long before it understands them. This process is slow and inefficient compared to instinct-driven development. Through comparison, it becomes clear that humans did not trade instinct for intelligence cleanly. They traded instinct for vulnerability first, and only later gained intelligence as compensation. During early life, the comparison is unforgiving. Against animals that arrive prepared, humans arrive exposed. Against bodies that know what to do, humans possess bodies that must be taught everything. This is not a flaw in comparison, it is the defining difference. The human infant is not equipped for the world it enters. Instead, the world must be reshaped to receive it. The comparison grows even more uncomfortable when survival speed is taken into account, because in nature, speed often decides who lives and who disappears. Most species are built to close the gap between birth and functionality as quickly as possible. Muscles activate early, coordination improves rapidly, and instincts guide behavior long before conscious learning is required. This speed reduces exposure. The shorter the helpless period, the smaller the window in which death can intervene. Humans stretch that window open. Weeks turn into months, months into years, and full independence remains distant for a long time. During this extended interval, the human body offers no acceleration mechanism. Development proceeds slowly, step by step, without shortcuts. Compared to other species, this looks inefficient, even reckless. Weather does not adapt to development. Disease does not pause for maturation. And yet, humans persist in delaying readiness. This suggests that speed was deliberately sacrificed. Instead of racing toward independence, humans slowed development down. The comparison reveals that human survival was never optimized for reaction time or physical readiness. It was optimized for integration. Slowness forced prolonged proximity between generations. Skills could not simply emerge. They had to be demonstrated, repeated, and reinforced. Knowledge accumulated externally, stored in other humans rather than embedded entirely in the body. While animals carry much of their survival knowledge inside their nervous systems at birth, humans distribute it across relationships. This distribution changes the meaning of comparison. Against animals, the human infant appears unfit. Against human groups, it makes sense. The infant is not meant to survive alone. It is meant to survive inside a network. The body's weakness ensures that separation is impossible early on. Leaving the group is not an option. Independence is delayed until social rules, language, and shared behaviors are internalized. Through comparison, it becomes clear that helplessness functions as a binding force. It locks the infant into the group long enough for cultural transmission to occur. Other species rely on instinct to replicate behavior. Humans rely on imitation, correction, and instruction. This requires time, attention, and patience. The comparison therefore exposes a hidden trade. Humans abandoned biological speed in favor of social depth. The cost is prolonged vulnerability. The benefit is a mind capable of absorbing complex systems that cannot be inherited genetically. Against the animal world, this strategy looks dangerous. Against the long arc of human history, it becomes clear that this danger was the price of something that could not be rushed. When the comparison with other species is carried to its logical end, the most striking realization is that humans did not merely accept helplessness, they normalized it, embedding it so deeply into their life cycle that it stopped appearing abnormal from the inside. In the animal world, helplessness is a temporary malfunction that must be corrected quickly. In humans, helplessness becomes the default starting condition. This normalization changes perception itself. What looks like weakness from the outside becomes invisible from within human societies. Because it is expected, prepared for, and culturally absorbed, homes are designed around infants. Daily routines reorganize themselves. Entire social roles emerge to protect and sustain beings who cannot protect themselves. No other species builds such extensive structures around its young. The comparison therefore reveals that humans did not adapt their offspring to the environment. They adapted the environment to the offspring. This is an evolutionary inversion. Instead of shaping bodies to meet reality, humans reshaped reality to meet fragile bodies. Over time, this pattern extended far beyond infancy. Tools were created to reduce physical demands. Language emerged to coordinate care. Social norms formed to regulate behavior and responsibility. All of this traces back to the same starting point: a being that cannot survive without others. Against animals, this looks inefficient. Against the human system, it becomes coherent. The helpless infant forces continuity, memory, and planning across generations. Knowledge cannot die with the individual. Because individuals begin life unable to acquire it alone, it must be preserved, shared, and taught. The comparison makes it clear that humans did not become social because they were intelligent. They became social because their offspring could not survive otherwise. Intelligence followed, not preceded. This condition, seen this way, The human newborn is not a failed animal, but the first link in a chain that leads away from instinct and toward culture. The cost is vulnerability. The reward is flexibility. But the comparison remains unsettling, because it shows that human dominance did not emerge from early strength, but from early weakness sustained by others. In the natural world, this is an unusual gamble. In humans, it became the rule. The reason human helplessness persists so stubbornly at birth becomes clearer when attention turns to the one organ that defines the species more than any other: the brain. The human brain is not simply large, it is disproportionately large relative to body size, consuming enormous amounts of energy and demanding an unusually long developmental timeline. At birth, the human brain is already massive compared to other species, yet it is still far from finished. This creates a biological conflict that cannot be resolved cleanly. A fully developed brain would not fit through the human birth canal because the pelvis is constrained by the requirements of upright walking. The result is a compromise that shapes everything that follows. Humans are born early, not in calendar terms, but in developmental terms. They enter the world before neurological construction is complete, because waiting any longer would make birth impossible. This means that helplessness is not caused by weakness alone, but by timing. Birth happens before readiness. Compared to other species, humans deliver their offspring at a stage that would be considered premature. The newborn brain is still wiring itself aggressively, forming connections at a pace that far exceeds what happens before birth. This externalized brain development leaves the infant vulnerable because the systems that regulate movement, emotion, and perception are incomplete. Other species finish this work in the womb, protected from environmental noise and disruption. Humans push it outward, exposing the developing brain to the world itself. This exposure increases risk, but it also increases plasticity. The unfinished brain can adapt to many possible environments, but only if survival is guaranteed by others during the process. The body becomes a temporary vessel for a brain still under construction. From a biological perspective, this is a dangerous design. The longer development remains unfinished, the longer vulnerability persists. Yet evolution accepted this risk because the alternative was worse: a smaller brain with less capacity. Humans chose capacity over readiness. The cost is helplessness. The benefit arrives later. This reframes birth as a forced compromise rather than a failure. The infant is not weak because it is poorly designed. It is weak because it carries a future that cannot yet function. The size and complexity of the brain delay independence and demand protection during the most fragile phase. This protection does not come from biology alone. It comes from social structures that evolved alongside the brain. Care, teaching, and long-term investment became necessary extensions of human neurodevelopment. Without them, the large brain would be a liability rather than an advantage. This means that helplessness at birth is inseparable from intelligence later in life. One cannot exist without the other. The newborn's vulnerability is the shadow cast by the adult mind. What looks like a biological flaw is actually the visible cost of a brain that refuses to be rushed. As the human brain continues developing outside the womb, the consequences of this early exposure quietly accumulate. Neural connections form at an extraordinary rate, shaped not only by genetics but by constant interaction with the surrounding world. Sounds, faces, touch, rhythm, and emotional signals all leave physical traces in the brain's structure. This level of openness is rare in nature. Most species protect critical brain development behind biological barriers, sealing it off until survival systems are ready. Humans do the opposite. They leave the brain open, unfinished, and responsive, while the body remains incapable of independent action. This creates a strange imbalance. The mind is hungry for input, while the body cannot act on its own behalf. Experience floods in faster than the infant can process it. Regulation must come from the outside. Calm is borrowed. Safety is borrowed. Even identity begins as something mirrored by others. This is why human infants are so sensitive to presence and absence. The developing brain does not simply receive care. It uses care as a framework for construction. Without consistent interaction, development does not slow gracefully. It fractures. Other species can afford brief gaps in care because their systems are already online. Humans cannot, because the brain is still assembling itself. This prolonged assembly process stretches helplessness far beyond the moment of birth. It extends into childhood, shaping how humans learn, adapt, and respond to stress. The nervous system grows in layers, each one depending on stability during the previous stage. Any disruption echoes forward. This is not fragility in the ordinary sense. It is exposure by design. The brain's openness allows for extraordinary flexibility, but it also means that nothing is filtered out early on. Everything matters. Every interaction leaves a mark. In this way, helplessness becomes the cost of adaptability. The infant cannot survive alone because survival is not the primary task yet. It requires constant reference to others. The human body remains passive, while the brain absorbs patterns that will later guide action. Independence is postponed until enough of those patterns are internalized. Compared to other species, this looks inefficient. The goal was range. Humans traded early competence for the ability to function in almost any environment, at the cost of prolonged vulnerability. This trade locks the species into dependency early on, ensuring that intelligence grows inside relationships rather than apart from them. As development continues, the imbalance between the growing brain and the incapable body becomes even more pronounced. The human infant begins to recognize patterns long before it can act on them. Faces become familiar. Voices carry emotional meaning. And rhythms of interaction start to shape expectation. Yet none of this recognition translates into control. The body remains slow, clumsy, and unresponsive, as if lagging behind the mind that inhabits it. This gap creates a peculiar condition in which awareness expands faster than agency. The infant senses tension before it can escape it, detects absence before it can seek presence, and experiences discomfort without any means to resolve it alone. In most species, awareness and action mature together. Perception quickly leads to movement. In humans, perception races ahead, while action trails far behind. This produces a nervous system that is highly reactive and deeply dependent. Regulation does not come from within, it must be borrowed repeatedly from caregivers. Calm is learned through being calmed. Safety is learned through being protected. Over time, these borrowed states are internalized, but the process is slow and fragile. The brain builds itself around patterns of care, not around self-sufficiency. This means that early relationships do not simply influence development. They become part of the nervous system's architecture. Other species rely on instinct to guide behavior under stress. Humans rely on memory, association, and learned responses. These cannot exist at birth. They must be constructed gradually, under conditions that keep the infant alive long enough for construction to continue. The helpless body enforces this delay. It prevents premature independence. It ensures that learning occurs before action, not after. But this arrangement also creates vulnerability that extends far beyond infancy. Because regulation is learned externally first, humans remain sensitive to social signals throughout life. Approval, rejection, presence, and absence continue to carry disproportionate weight. What begins as biological necessity becomes psychological pattern. The brain never fully forgets that it once depended on others to regulate its most basic states. This dependency is not erased by maturity. It is transformed. Compared to other species, humans retain a longer memory of vulnerability. The extended development of the brain allows for complex thought, language, and imagination. But it also leaves lasting sensitivity. The price of adaptability is exposure. The longer the brain remains open to shaping, the more it absorbs, and the more it is affected by what it absorbs. This makes human intelligence inseparable from human fragility. The very process that allows the brain to grow beyond instinct also ensures that it carries traces of early dependence forward into adult life. Independence is achieved slowly and never completely. The body may grow strong, but the nervous system remembers a time when strength did not exist, and that memory quietly influences how humans respond to uncertainty, threat, and connection long after helplessness is supposed to be over. This long delay between awareness and control reshapes how the human brain learns to manage risk. Because the infant cannot escape danger or correct discomfort through action, the nervous system becomes tuned to signals rather than solutions. Small changes in tone, facial expression, and movement take on exaggerated importance. The brain learns to scan, anticipate, and react long before it can do anything about what it detects. In other species, this kind of sensitivity would be inefficient. Instinctive action reduces the need for prolonged vigilance. In humans, vigilance replaces action during early life. The helpless body forces the brain to prioritize prediction over response. Over time, this builds a mind that is exceptionally good at reading social environments, but also one that is easily overwhelmed by them. Stress does not trigger immediate escape. It triggers heightened alertness. Relief does not come from solving the problem directly. It comes from reassurance provided by others. This pattern becomes deeply ingrained. As development progresses, the child gains mobility and control, but the early wiring does not disappear. The brain continues to rely on external cues to regulate internal states. This is why human stress is so often social rather than physical. Threats are interpreted through relationships, expectations, and imagined outcomes rather than immediate danger. The roots of this can be traced back to a time when survival truly depended on another person's awareness. The helpless infant could not afford to ignore social signals because those signals determined whether care would arrive in time. As a result, the brain evolved to treat social information as vital. Compared to other species, this creates a nervous system that is both sophisticated and fragile. Sophisticated because it can navigate complex social systems, fragile because those systems are never fully predictable. The extended development of the brain amplifies this effect. Because construction continues for so long, patterns formed early are reinforced repeatedly. Sensitivity becomes habit. Dependence becomes expectation. Even as physical independence increases, emotional regulation remains linked to connection. This does not mean humans are weak. It means they are wired differently. Their brains are shaped by prolonged exposure rather than early closure. In animals, development locks in quickly, reducing flexibility but increasing stability. In humans, development stays open, increasing adaptability but prolonging uncertainty. The helpless body enforces this openness by preventing premature closure. It keeps the brain in a state of learning rather than action. The cost is prolonged vulnerability. The benefit is a mind capable of absorbing layers of meaning, culture, and abstraction that instinct alone cannot provide. But the balance is delicate. The same openness that allows for intelligence also allows for anxiety, overstimulation, and exhaustion. From the very beginning, the human brain is built under conditions of reliance, scanning the world through others before it can stand on its own. This prolonged reliance changes not only how the brain processes danger, but how it understands control itself. Because early survival depends on others responding correctly, the developing mind learns that outcomes are often external rather than self-generated. Relief arrives when someone intervenes. Safety returns when someone notices. Needs are met when someone decides to meet them. This quietly shapes expectations about the world. In other species, action produces results quickly, reinforcing a direct link between effort and outcome. In humans, especially early on, that link is delayed and indirect. The brain adapts by focusing less on immediate action and more on influencing the environment socially. Signals replace movements. Expressions replace escapes. Communication precedes control. This is why human infants invest so much energy in social signaling long before they can act physically. Eye contact, vocalization, and emotional expression become survival tools. The body cannot move away from threat, so the mind learns to draw others closer. This pattern does not vanish with age. It scales up. As language develops, signals become more complex. Requests replace cries. Explanations replace gestures, but the underlying structure remains the same. Outcomes are still negotiated through others. The early helplessness teaches the brain that survival is a cooperative process, not an individual one. This has profound consequences. It produces a species that is exceptionally good at coordination, persuasion, and shared problem-solving. But it also produces a species that is deeply affected by uncertainty, rejection, and loss of control. Because the brain was shaped during a period when control was impossible, it remains sensitive to situations that resemble that early state. Powerlessness, unpredictability, and isolation trigger responses that feel disproportionate because they echo a time when such conditions were genuinely life-threatening. Other species close this window quickly. Humans leave it open for years. The brain grows large and flexible, but it also grows accustomed to depending on structures beyond itself. Even when physical strength and independence are achieved, the nervous system retains a memory of dependence. This is not a conscious memory. It is a pattern of response. It influences how humans handle stress, authority, and belonging. The same developmental path that produces creativity and abstract thought also produces vulnerability to overload. The helpless body at birth forces the brain to grow in a way that privileges connection over control. Strength arrives later, but it is built on a foundation of reliance. The brain never fully forgets that it once needed others to survive, and that memory continues to shape behavior long after the body appears capable of standing alone. As this long developmental arc reaches its later stages, the original compromise becomes fully visible. The brain that was forced to grow slowly, openly, and in constant reference to others eventually gains extraordinary abilities. But it never sheds the conditions under which it was built. The delayed closure of development leaves traces that persist into adulthood, shaping how humans think, feel, and relate to the world. Unlike other species, whose brains lock into stable patterns early, the human brain remains malleable for an unusually long time. This allows for learning, creativity, and adaptation on a scale that instinct-driven systems cannot match. But it also means that uncertainty remains deeply embedded. The brain is powerful, yet it is rarely at rest. It anticipates, imagines, replays, and worries because it was shaped in an environment where survival depended on constant monitoring of others. The helplessness of birth is not erased by maturity. It is transformed into a lifelong sensitivity to context. Humans do not simply respond to the present moment. They project themselves into possible futures, rehearse outcomes, and revisit past experiences, often exhausting their own nervous systems in the process. This is the final cost of the early compromise. A brain built to remain open cannot easily shut down. The same plasticity that enables intelligence also enables rumination. The same social awareness that ensures cooperation also amplifies stress. Other species trade flexibility for stability. Humans do the opposite. They carry instability forward in exchange for range. Seen through this lens, helplessness at birth is not a temporary weakness to be overcome, but the first condition of a mind that will never fully close itself off from the world. The human brain grows large because it is unfinished when it arrives, and it remains restless because it was shaped during a time when control did not exist. This restlessness fuels progress, art, science, and culture. But it also generates anxiety, exhaustion, and fragility. The body eventually becomes capable, but the brain remembers what it cost to get there. In that sense, the helpless infant is still present inside the adult mind, not as a memory, but as a structure. Intelligence is built on delayed readiness. Awareness is built on early exposure, and the price of a brain that can understand almost anything is that it never fully forgets what it was like to need everything from others. The helplessness that defines human birth does not end when the body learns to walk or the hands learn to grasp, because the original problem was never only physical weakness. It was dependence itself. And that dependence stretches forward into every stage of development. Long after muscles strengthen and coordination improves, the human child remains unusually reliant on others for guidance, protection, and regulation. Compared to other species, this extended dependency is striking. Many animals reach functional independence quickly, even if they remain socially connected. Humans do not. The child may move on its own, but it cannot judge danger reliably, cannot regulate emotion consistently, and cannot survive without social structures that anticipate its needs. This is not a delay that corrects itself naturally. It is a continuation of the same biological compromise that began at birth. The brain that was unfinished at delivery continues to mature slowly, and during this time, the child depends on external systems to compensate for internal limitations. Rules replace instincts. Supervision replaces reflex. Culture replaces biology. This prolonged dependency is not accidental. It is the direct result of being born before readiness. Because humans enter the world neurologically unfinished, development must occur under protection, not just briefly, but for years. This creates a life pattern in which independence is postponed repeatedly. Each stage of growth reveals new capacities, but also new vulnerabilities. As soon as one layer stabilizes, another remains open. Emotional regulation, social judgment, impulse control, and long-term planning all mature late, long after physical mobility has arrived. This mismatch creates a child who appears capable but remains fragile. The body can move, but the mind cannot yet manage consequences. The result is a species that requires extended care far beyond infancy. From an evolutionary perspective, this is costly. Every year of dependency increases risk, drains resources, and slows group mobility. Yet humans accepted this cost because the alternative was not viable. A brain capable of complex thought cannot be rushed into completion without losing what makes it powerful. The same reason humans are born helpless is the reason they remain dependent for so long. Growth happens in the world, not sealed away inside the body. This keeps vulnerability active well beyond birth, and each additional year of dependence reinforces the original condition. The child learns not just how to act, but how to be guided. Authority, trust, imitation, and instruction become survival mechanisms. The question returns again, pressing and unavoidable. Why would evolution tolerate such prolonged reliance unless it was essential to what humans become? The answer begins to emerge here. Human survival was never meant to be solitary. It was structured around long-term guidance, shared responsibility, and delayed autonomy. The helplessness of birth sets this pattern in motion, and extended childhood locks it in. What starts as biological necessity becomes a defining feature of the species. The child does not simply outgrow helplessness. It transforms it into dependence on systems, norms, and relationships that continue to shape behavior long after physical weakness fades. The reason humans begin life unable to survive alone is the same reason they take so long to stand alone later. Dependence is not a temporary flaw in the design. It is the design. As this prolonged dependence continues, it becomes clear that it is not simply an extended version of infancy, but a structural condition that reshapes how humans relate to safety, decision-making, and responsibility. Because early survival depended on others managing risk, the developing mind learns that danger is something identified and controlled externally before it is understood internally. This pattern does not disappear when the child grows taller or stronger. It evolves. Children rely on rules not because rules are efficient, but because instinct is insufficient. Boundaries, supervision, and repeated correction take the place of automatic survival responses. Other species need far less of this scaffolding, because their bodies and instincts carry more of the burden. Humans shift that burden outward. Society becomes the protective shell that biology did not provide at birth. Schools, laws, schedules, and social expectations are not optional cultural additions. They are extensions of the same dependency that began in the cradle. This is why human development requires constant structure. Without it, behavior becomes unstable, impulsive, or dangerous. The nervous system that developed under prolonged care does not self-regulate easily without external reference points. This ties directly back to the original helplessness. A species born ready would not need such extensive guidance later. The delay in neurological completion creates a long window in which learning must replace instinct. During this window, mistakes are costly, not only to the individual but to the group. As a result, human societies evolve mechanisms to manage immaturity over extended periods. Adolescence itself becomes a prolonged transition rather than a brief phase. Physical capability arrives before psychological readiness, creating tension between what the body can do and what the mind can safely manage. This mismatch is a direct continuation of being born before readiness. The body advances in stages, but the brain follows a slower, layered timeline. Each layer requires external support until it stabilizes. Independence is granted gradually, not because of trust, but because the system cannot absorb the risk of full autonomy too early. The same logic that keeps a newborn alive keeps an adolescent supervised. The root cause does not change. Humans remain dependent because the conditions that created helplessness at birth continue to shape development long after birth itself is over. The species did not evolve to produce immediately self-sufficient individuals. It evolved to produce individuals who require time, guidance, and social containment before they can function safely. The question therefore remains consistent. Humans begin life helpless because they are designed to grow inside systems, not outside them, and that design continues to assert itself at every stage of growth. This extended dependence does not only shape childhood behavior, it quietly reorganizes how humans understand responsibility itself. Because survival began as something managed by others, responsibility is introduced gradually rather than assumed. Children are not expected to carry the full weight of consequences, not because they are morally unfit, but because their nervous systems are still calibrating. Supervision, correction, and repetition exist to substitute for instincts that never fully developed at birth. In species where offspring arrive ready, responsibility is embedded in the body. Actions immediately produce outcomes, and learning is fast because failure is survivable. In humans, early failure is not survivable, so learning must be buffered. This buffering continues far longer than in other species, creating a developmental environment where protection precedes accountability. As a result, human growth relies on layered handovers of control. Authority is transferred slowly, piece by piece, from caregivers to the individual. Each transfer only occurs when the risk becomes manageable. This is why human societies invest so heavily in gradual transitions. Childhood, adolescence, early adulthood. These are not cultural inventions. They are biological accommodations. They exist because the brain that was unfinished at birth remains unfinished for a long time. Emotional regulation, impulse control, and long-term judgment mature late, often after the body has already become capable of causing harm. Laws, education systems, and social expectations step in to regulate behavior, while internal systems catch up. This dependence on structure can look like weakness, but it is the downstream effect of the same condition that made humans helpless at birth. A species that begins life without self-regulating systems must build them slowly, and until they are built, substitutes are required. The result is a prolonged period in which individuals appear capable but remain unstable without guidance. This instability is not a failure of character. It is a consequence of developmental timing. Humans are not born with the internal brakes that other species possess. They must be installed through experience, repetition, and correction. This installation takes years, sometimes decades. The original helplessness explains why. Development was externalized from the start, and so regulation must also be externalized until it can be internalized. Each stage of growth revisits the same problem in a new form. The infant needs physical protection. The child needs behavioral boundaries. The adolescent needs social containment. The adult needs systems that coordinate complex interaction. All of these layers trace back to the same root cause. Humans enter the world before they are neurologically ready to manage themselves. Extended dependence is not an anomaly. It is the continuation of that first compromise. The question remains the same, only scaled up. Why would a species accept such prolonged reliance unless it was fundamental to what it becomes? As dependence stretches forward, it begins to shape not only how humans grow, but how they experience freedom. Because autonomy arrives late and in fragments, freedom is never absolute. It is granted conditionally, monitored, and often reversible. This is not a cultural quirk. It is a developmental necessity rooted in the same origin as helplessness at birth. A nervous system that began life without internal regulation cannot be released all at once without risking collapse. Freedom must be staged. Privileges appear before capacities are fully stable, then are pulled back when instability shows. This push and pull repeats across development, creating tension between desire and restraint. Other species do not experience this in the same way. When autonomy arrives, it arrives fully, because the body and instincts are already aligned. In humans, alignment lags. The body gains power faster than the brain gains restraint. This imbalance forces society to remain involved long after physical independence is visible. Supervision persists because the original condition persists in another form. The helpless infant depended on others to survive. The growing human depends on others to prevent self-destruction. This continuity is often misunderstood as moral weakness, but it is structural. The brain that grew under protection expects containment when overwhelmed. When containment is absent, stress escalates quickly. This is why transitions that remove structure abruptly are so destabilizing for humans. Sudden loss of guidance, routine, or social anchoring often produces anxiety rather than relief. The nervous system does not interpret freedom as safety. It interprets it as exposure. This reaction traces directly back to the first exposure at birth, when survival depended entirely on others managing the environment. That early pattern teaches the brain that safety comes from structure, not from isolation. As a result, humans seek frameworks, even when they appear restrictive. Rules, roles, and expectations provide predictability that instinct never supplied. The extended dependence of childhood trains the brain to function inside systems, not outside them. When those systems weaken, the same vulnerability that existed at birth reappears, now expressed as confusion, impulsivity, or fear. The body may be capable, but the nervous system remembers a time when capability did not exist. This memory is not conscious, but it shapes behavior. Freedom, for humans, is always negotiated with safety. Independence is never complete. It is layered over a foundation built during helplessness. The reason humans do not shed dependence cleanly is the same reason they begin life without autonomy. Development was never internal from the start. It was shared. And because it was shared, it cannot be fully reclaimed later. Each stage of growth revisits the same truth in a different form. Humans survive best when guided, contained, and connected. The question returns again. Unavoidable. A species born unable to stand alone does not easily learn how to stand alone later, because standing alone was never the original plan. When the arc of extended dependence is viewed as a whole, it becomes clear that it is not an unfortunate delay on the way to independence, but a continuation of the same condition that defined the beginning of life. Humans do not simply take longer to grow up. They grow differently. The nervous system that entered the world unfinished requires layers of external support to mature, and those layers never fully disappear. Even adulthood relies on shared systems to stabilize behavior, distribute risk, and manage complexity. Workplaces, laws, families, and social norms do not merely organize society. They perform regulatory functions that biology did not complete early on. This is why isolation is so destabilizing for humans compared to other species. Remove enough structure, and behavior deteriorates quickly. This does not happen because humans are weak-minded, but because their development was never designed for solitary functioning. The same reason a human infant cannot survive alone explains why adults struggle without guidance, feedback, and connection. The dependency has changed form, but it has not vanished. This directly answers the central question. Humans are born helpless because their survival strategy does not reside in early competence. It resides in prolonged shaping. The species delayed readiness in exchange for depth, flexibility, and the ability to operate inside complex systems. That exchange demands time, supervision, and containment. Childhood extends because development extends. Dependence persists because regulation arrives slowly. The helplessness at birth initiates a life course built around external scaffolding that is gradually internalized but never fully replaced. Each stage adds capacity, but also reveals new vulnerabilities that require guidance. A species that begins life neurologically unfinished cannot suddenly become self-sufficient without losing what makes it human. Extended dependence is the mechanism that protects the unfinished brain while it becomes capable of abstraction, cooperation, and foresight. The price is vulnerability. The reward is range. And that trade remains consistent from the first breath to adulthood. Humans do not start helpless and then become independent. They start helpless and become interdependent. The condition that made survival impossible alone at birth becomes the condition that makes complex life possible later. Helplessness is not something humans escape, it is something they transform. And the reason it lasts so long is the same reason it exists at all. A mind built to function inside relationships cannot be rushed into standing alone. What becomes unavoidable at this stage is the cost of beginning life unfinished, because the same openness that allowed humans to grow complex minds also left them permanently exposed to overload. Being born helpless did not only delay independence, it rewired how the human nervous system handles pressure. When regulation comes from the outside first, the brain learns to depend on external order to remain stable. The human mind becomes powerful, but it also becomes sensitive, easily strained when structure breaks down. This is the hidden price of delayed readiness. Other species close development early and lock stability in place. Humans leave development open, trading early resilience for long-term flexibility. The result is a nervous system that can handle abstraction, imagination, and complexity, but struggles under sustained uncertainty. This directly traces back to helplessness at birth. A brain that began life unable to regulate itself learns regulation through repetition, guidance, and correction. When those supports weaken, stress rises quickly. This is why modern human environments, filled with constant stimulation and weak containment, produce exhaustion rather than adaptation. The system was never designed for constant input without regulation. From the beginning, regulation was shared. Remove the sharing, and overload follows. This is not a flaw that appears later. It is the delayed echo of early dependence. The infant needed others to filter the world. The adult still needs systems to do the same. When those systems fail, the mind becomes overwhelmed. This is the cost side of the evolutionary trade. Helplessness allowed the brain to grow large and open. But openness means vulnerability. A closed system resists disturbance. An open one absorbs it. Humans absorbed the world before they could act on it, and that pattern never fully reversed. The same openness that makes learning possible also makes rest difficult. The brain remains alert, scanning, anticipating, and rehearsing, because it was built under conditions where missing a signal once meant danger. This is why human intelligence often feels exhausting. It did not emerge from early strength, but from early exposure. And exposure always carries a cost. The question returns again, grounding the entire arc. Humans are born helpless because the species chose openness over protection, and that choice continues to shape how the mind bears weight long after the body appears capable. As this cost accumulates, it becomes clear that overload is not a modern malfunction layered on top of an otherwise stable system, but a predictable outcome of a mind that began life without internal filters. At birth, the human brain could not decide what mattered and what did not. Everything arrived unfiltered, and survival depended on others narrowing the field. Over time, external filtering became internalized, but never fully. The brain learned patterns, rules, and expectations, yet it never developed the kind of hard biological limits that protect other species from excess input. This is the consequence of being born before readiness. A system built while exposed cannot later pretend exposure does not exist. As adults, humans are capable of handling complex information, but they are also uniquely vulnerable to cognitive saturation. Noise, choices, social signals, imagined futures, and unresolved possibilities pile up quickly. Other species experience the present. Humans carry the present, the past, and the possible future at the same time. This is not simply intelligence. It is an open loop that never fully closes. The reason this matters for the central question is direct. A species that began life with complete helplessness could not rely on instinctive shutdown to protect the nervous system. Shutting down would have meant death. Instead, the brain learned to stay alert, to keep scanning for cues that care was coming. That vigilance became structural. It does not switch off easily later. When modern life removes clear signals of safety and replaces them with constant ambiguity, the old pattern reactivates. The nervous system responds as if regulation is missing, because from the very beginning, regulation was something provided, not assumed. Overload, then, is not weakness. It is the byproduct of a brain that learned to survive by staying open. This is why humans struggle more than other species when boundaries dissolve. Too many choices feel paralyzing. Too much freedom feels destabilizing. Too much information feels threatening. These reactions trace back to the same origin: a brain that grew while being managed, guided, and filtered by others. Remove filtering, and the system strains. The helpless infant could not handle the world alone. The adult still cannot handle an unbounded world without structure. This continuity answers the question again, from another angle. Humans are born helpless because their minds are designed to be shaped, not shielded. That shaping requires exposure, and exposure requires care. The cost is that the system never fully learns how to close itself. Other species gain protection through instinct. Humans gain range through openness. The trade-off is permanent. Intelligence expands capacity, but it also expands vulnerability. The same developmental path that makes abstract thought possible ensures that overload is always nearby. The beginning explains the outcome. A species that starts life unable to regulate itself will always need external limits to remain stable. Helplessness was not left behind. It matured into sensitivity. This sensitivity reveals itself most clearly in how humans respond to pressure over time. Because early regulation was external, stress is experienced less as a signal to act and more as a signal that something is wrong with the surrounding system. The mind searches for structure, reassurance, or guidance, not simply for a physical solution. Other species resolve stress through movement or instinctive behavior. Humans resolve it through meaning, explanation, and social alignment. This difference exists because the helpless infant could not resolve anything alone. Relief arrived when someone else intervened, when order was restored from the outside. That early pattern teaches the nervous system to expect relief through context rather than action. As adults, humans still seek frameworks when overwhelmed. They look for rules, narratives, routines, and systems that promise containment. When those frameworks fracture, stress does not remain localized. It spreads. The mind fills gaps with anticipation and imagination, escalating strain rather than releasing it. This is the psychological cost of delayed readiness. A brain that learned survival through guidance becomes uncomfortable in environments without clear signals of safety. Ambiguity feels threatening because it resembles the original state of dependence, when outcomes were uncertain and survival was not guaranteed by the self. This ties directly back to the central question. Humans are born helpless because their nervous systems are not built to rely on immediate competence. They are built to rely on structured surroundings. That reliance continues to influence how pressure is processed long after physical weakness disappears. When structure weakens, the old vulnerability resurfaces. Overload is not a failure to cope, it is a reminder of how coping was learned. The infant survived by staying alert until care arrived. The adult, facing complexity without clear containment, stays alert in the same way. The difference is that the threats are no longer physical, but cognitive and social. Expectations, comparisons, and imagined consequences pile up. The mind does not shut down because shutting down once meant death. It stays active, searching for signals that stability has returned. This explains why human stress often feels endless. The system was not designed to close quickly. It was designed to remain open until safety was confirmed externally. The helpless beginning shaped a mind that waits for order rather than creating it instantly. And when order is delayed or absent, the waiting becomes exhausting. The root cause remains unchanged. A species that began life without internal regulation carries that openness forward. The cost of being born helpless is a mind that can think endlessly, but rest only when structure is restored. This exhaustion deepens when responsibility expands faster than internal regulation, because the mind is asked to carry weight it was never designed to bear alone. Early in life, responsibility was distributed. Needs were noticed by others. Boundaries were enforced externally. Decisions were filtered before reaching the child. As adulthood approaches, that filtering is reduced, but the nervous system that learned under protection does not suddenly become self-contained. Instead, responsibility accumulates on top of a system built for shared regulation. This creates strain. Humans must plan, choose, anticipate, and judge constantly, often without the clear feedback that once stabilized them. Other species rely on instinct to limit responsibility. Humans rely on abstraction, which multiplies it. Every choice branches into imagined outcomes. Every failure echoes forward. This is not simply complexity. It is the downstream effect of being born before internal brakes existed. A brain that grew under guidance expects guidance. When it must provide that guidance to itself without support, it compensates by overthinking. Overload becomes the substitute for missing containment. This is why humans invent external aids long after physical dependence ends. Calendars, schedules, laws, hierarchies, and routines act as borrowed regulators. They are not conveniences, they are stabilizers. Remove them, and stress rises sharply. This behavior is consistent with the original condition. The helpless infant could not survive without structure imposed from the outside. The adult struggles without structure for the same reason. The difference is scale, not kind. The cost of delayed readiness appears again here. Intelligence increases capacity, but it also increases the number of variables the mind must track. Without firm limits, the system saturates. Other species avoid this by keeping cognition narrow. Humans avoid it by externalizing control. When external control weakens, overload fills the gap. This reveals a hard truth connected directly to the central question. Humans are born helpless because their survival strategy requires long-term scaffolding. That scaffolding never fully dissolves. It changes form, becoming social, institutional, and symbolic, but it remains necessary. A species that began life without internal regulation cannot later rely on internal regulation alone. The openness that made intelligence possible also made self-containment difficult. Overload is not a failure to adapt. It is the predictable outcome of a system that was never meant to operate in isolation. It expanded into a lifelong need for structure that intelligence alone cannot replace. This lifelong need for structure exposes the final tension created by being born helpless, the conflict between autonomy and stability. Humans value independence, yet their nervous systems were assembled under conditions where independence did not exist. From the start, survival depended on alignment with others, not separation from them. That alignment trained the brain to treat coherence as safety. When coherence breaks, stress rises. This explains why modern environments that emphasize constant self-direction often produce anxiety rather than confidence. Choice without containment feels less like freedom and more like exposure. The mind reacts as it once did in infancy, scanning for cues that order will return. Other species do not experience this conflict in the same way. Their instincts close the loop between perception and action quickly, limiting uncertainty. Humans leave the loop open. They imagine alternatives, replay consequences, and anticipate judgment. This capacity emerges from the same developmental openness that made helplessness unavoidable at birth. A brain that was finished early would not do this. It would act and move on. Humans hesitate because hesitation once kept them alive long enough for help to arrive. That early strategy persists. The central question sharpens here. Humans are born helpless because their survival strategy prioritizes coordination over independence. That priority never reverses. Autonomy is layered on top of dependence, not substituted for it. When autonomy outpaces support, instability follows. This is why periods of rapid change are so destabilizing for humans. The nervous system interprets loss of structure as danger, because at the beginning of life, danger truly meant abandonment. Overload, indecision, and fatigue are modern expressions of an ancient condition. They are not signs that humans are poorly adapted. They are signs that the original adaptation is still active. The helpless infant could not create order. It waited for order to be provided. The adult, facing complex systems without clear boundaries, waits in the same way, now expressed as searching, planning, and worrying. Intelligence amplifies this pattern rather than erasing it. The more possibilities the mind can imagine, the more it needs limits to remain stable. This is the cost that runs parallel to capability. Being born helpless did not simply delay independence. It defined the terms under which independence would later exist. Freedom became possible only inside frameworks. Remove the frameworks, and the old vulnerability reappears. The question answers itself again. Humans begin life unable to stand alone because they were never meant to stand alone completely, not then and not later. When this tension reaches its limit, the full price of beginning life, helpless becomes impossible to ignore. The human nervous system, built under prolonged guidance and external regulation, carries an expectation that order will exist somewhere outside the self. When that expectation is repeatedly violated, strain accumulates. Fatigue sets in not because humans lack strength, but because the system is asked to self-regulate beyond what it was designed to do alone. This is the final consequence of delayed readiness. The brain that grew while being supported never fully internalized closure. It learned to remain open until stability appeared, and when stability does not arrive, it stays open indefinitely. This openness fuels imagination, problem-solving, and creativity. Other species shut down stress responses quickly because their survival systems close the loop between threat and action. Humans leave the loop open because action was once impossible. The helpless infant could not resolve danger. It endured until resolution came from outside. That endurance became structural. As adults, humans endure uncertainty in the same way, holding tension rather than releasing it. This explains why modern life, with its constant demands and weak containment, overwhelms a species that appears so capable. Capability grew out of dependence, not independence. Intelligence grew out of exposure, not protection. The cost is that the mind never fully stops compensating. This brings the central question into sharp focus one last time. Humans are born helpless because their evolutionary path required a brain that stayed open long enough to absorb complexity. That openness demanded care, guidance, and structure. When those supports fade, the system strains. Helplessness was not left behind in infancy. It matured into a lifelong sensitivity to disorder. Survival no longer depends on physical care, but on coherence, meaning, and reliable systems. Remove those, and the old vulnerability resurfaces. The helpless beginning explains the fragile middle and the exhausted present. It was never a mistake. It was the cost of building a mind that could hold more than instinct alone. When this evolutionary design meets the modern world, the original condition is not corrected. It is amplified. Humans did not stop being the species that begins life helpless. They built environments that quietly assume that helplessness no longer matters. The body appears capable, so the system removes containment. Yet, the nervous system remains the same one that grew under prolonged guidance. Modern life increases speed, choice, and exposure while reducing clear structure, predictable rhythms, and shared regulation. This creates a direct collision with the original design. A brain that developed by relying on external order is now expected to generate order continuously from within. That expectation does not align with how the system was built. The helpless infant survived because the environment filtered the world. The modern adult is flooded by it. Information arrives without hierarchy. Responsibility expands without clear boundaries. And social signals multiply without resolution. This does not create strength. It recreates exposure. The same openness that required protection at birth is now left unprotected. As a result, the nervous system reacts, as it always has, under such conditions. Heightened alertness, constant scanning, and difficulty shutting down. This reaction is not a modern pathology. It is the same ancient response expressed in a new context. The infant stayed alert because care might arrive at any moment. The adult stays alert because meaning, safety, or resolution might appear in the next message, decision, or outcome. The loop never closes. This directly answers the central question again. Humans are born helpless because their survival strategy depends on shaped environments. When the environment stops shaping and starts overwhelming, the original vulnerability resurfaces. Modern life does not break humans. It exposes the limits of a system that was never meant to self-contain completely. The more complex the environment becomes, the more it demands internal regulation that the species did not evolve to supply alone. Helplessness at birth explains why modern autonomy feels heavy rather than liberating. Freedom without containment mirrors exposure without protection. The body can handle it. The nervous system cannot. And so the modern human carries forward the same condition, now expressed as mental fatigue rather than physical dependence. As modern environments continue to strip away shared regulation, the human nervous system is pushed into a role it was never designed to hold alone. Decisions that were once distributed across families, communities, and stable traditions are now individualized. The responsibility to choose correctly, perform consistently, and self-regulate endlessly is placed on a system that was built to be guided. This mismatch is not subtle. It shows up in how quickly humans become overwhelmed by options, how often they doubt their own decisions, and how exhausting it feels to maintain constant self-control. This exhaustion does not come from laziness or weakness. It comes from a design conflict that traces directly back to the beginning of life. A species that is born helpless learns regulation through presence, repetition, and shared structure. When those supports are removed, the system compensates by increasing vigilance. The mind works harder, not smarter. It rehearses outcomes, scans for mistakes, and anticipates judgment, because that was once the only way to survive while waiting for care. In early life, alertness replaced action. In modern life, alertness replaces rest. This explains why modern stress often feels diffuse and endless, rather than acute and solvable. There is no clear signal that safety has returned, because safety is no longer provided externally in a consistent way. Other species rely on instinctive shutdown after danger passes. Humans wait for reassurance that rarely arrives. The central question returns with force here. Humans are born helpless because their survival depends on environments that absorb risk and regulate exposure. When modern systems reverse that arrangement, placing regulation back onto the individual, the original vulnerability is reactivated. The mind responds as it did at the beginning of life, staying alert in the absence of containment. This is why constant self-management feels unnatural. The nervous system was not designed to be its own caretaker at all times. It was designed to develop under care and gradually internalize structure, not to replace it entirely. Modern life asks for replacement, not supplementation. The result is chronic strain. This strain is not evidence that humans are failing to adapt. It is evidence that the adaptation has limits. The helpless infant could not regulate alone and survived only because regulation was shared. The modern adult, asked to regulate alone in an unfiltered environment, experiences the same exposure in a different form. The connection is direct and unavoidable. Being born helpless is not an early inconvenience that evolution forgot to fix. It is the foundation of a system that requires external order to function well. When that order dissolves, the system does not become stronger. It becomes louder, more anxious, and more tired. Modern overload is not new. It is the echo of the same condition that made human birth so fragile. This collision between ancient design and modern demand becomes clearest in how humans experience time. The helpless infant lived in a state where the future was uncertain, and relief depended entirely on when care would arrive. Waiting was unavoidable. Alertness filled the gap. In modern life, that same waiting never truly ends. Deadlines replace caregivers, notifications replace voices, and uncertainty stretches forward without a clear moment of resolution. It does not read it as abstract pressure. It reads it as exposure. The mind stays active because it once had to. This is why modern humans struggle to disengage, even when nothing immediate is wrong. Rest feels unsafe when outcomes remain unresolved. Other species rest when danger passes. Humans rest when certainty returns. And certainty is rare in environments that never fully close their loops. This is not a cultural accident. It is a direct extension of being born before readiness. A system that learned to survive by waiting for order, cannot easily tolerate open-ended demands. Each unfinished task, each unanswered message, each postponed decision keeps the loop open. The brain responds as it did in early life, maintaining vigilance in case regulation appears. This constant partial activation drains energy without providing release. The central question anchors this again. Humans are born helpless because their development required prolonged exposure to uncertainty while relying on others to resolve it. Modern life recreates uncertainty without reliably resolving it. The environment asks for endurance without providing closure. The nervous system does not evolve fast enough to reinterpret this as harmless. It reacts according to its original training. Helplessness taught the brain to stay awake until order arrived. Intelligence later expanded what order means, but did not change the rule. When order is delayed, the system waits. When waiting becomes permanent, exhaustion follows. This is why modern fatigue often feels deeper than physical tiredness. It is the fatigue of a system that never receives the signal to stand down. The beginning explains the present. A species that entered life unable to control outcomes learned to survive by remaining open. That openness now stretches across timelines far longer than biology prepared it for. The cost is constant low-level strain. The design has not failed. It is being used beyond its original conditions. This overextension shows itself in how modern humans respond to risk, because risk is no longer immediate or visible, yet it is never absent. The helpless infant faced clear danger and clear relief. Hunger ended when feeding arrived. Cold ended when warmth was provided. In modern life, threats are abstract, delayed, and probabilistic. Careers, finances, reputation, and future stability hover without resolution. The nervous system treats these uncertainties as ongoing exposure because the original system was built to respond to unresolved dependence. When relief is not clearly delivered, vigilance persists. This is why humans struggle to feel safe even when materially secure. Safety was never just the absence of danger. It was the presence of regulation. Being born helpless taught the brain that protection comes from structured response, not from statistics. Modern systems offer probability, not presence. They explain risk without containing it. The nervous system does not relax in response to explanations. It relaxes in response to signals that someone or something is actively holding the situation. When those signals are missing, the brain remains on duty. Other species evolved to disengage once physical threat disappears. Humans evolved to disengage when relational order returns. This distinction matters. Modern environments reduce visible caretaking while increasing invisible pressure. The result is a constant mismatch between what the brain expects and what it receives. The central question remains intact here. Humans are born helpless because their survival strategy assumes shared management of risk. When risk is privatized and internalized, the system strains. Individuals are asked to carry futures alone that were once carried collectively. The nervous system responds as if abandonment is possible, because at the beginning of life, abandonment truly was fatal. This is why reassurance, authority, and reliable frameworks feel calming even to capable adults. They recreate the original condition of safety. Someone else is watching the edge. Modern stress is not caused by too much responsibility alone. It is caused by responsibility without visible containment. The helpless beginning trained the brain to wait for containment before resting. Modern life delays containment indefinitely. The result is sustained activation, not because humans are fragile, but because the design that once kept infants alive is now being asked to manage complexity without the supports it evolved alongside. This sustained activation begins to reshape how humans interpret themselves, because when a system remains under pressure without clear containment, it does not simply feel stressed. It feels inadequate. The helpless infant did not interpret exposure as personal failure. It simply existed within it. But the modern adult, carrying the same nervous system inside a culture that praises self-sufficiency, often turns exposure inward. Unresolved pressure becomes self-judgment. Difficulty resting becomes guilt. Needing structure becomes weakness. This internalization deepens strain rather than relieving it. The brain that was built to rely on shared regulation is now asked to explain its own limits, and it does so by blaming itself. This reaction makes sense only when traced back to the beginning. Humans are born helpless because regulation was never meant to be fully internal from the start. It was meant to be shared, visible, and reliable. When that sharing disappears, the nervous system does not quietly adapt. It searches for the missing support. If it cannot find it externally, it looks inward and concludes that something is wrong. This is why modern stress often feels personal rather than situational. The design conflict is misread as individual failure. Other species do not experience this confusion because their regulation is largely internal and instinctive. Humans built regulation slowly, through repeated external containment. Remove containment, and the system protests. Fatigue, doubt, and rumination take the place of physical distress. The central question holds steady here. Humans are born helpless because their survival strategy depends on environments that actively hold them. When modern life withdraws that holding while demanding constant performance, the original vulnerability is exposed. The mind reacts as it did at the beginning of life, staying alert, searching for signs that someone or something is managing the edge. When no such signs appear, the system does not shut down. It tightens. This tightening is often mistaken for resilience. In reality, it is endurance without relief. The helpless infant endured until care arrived. The modern adult endures because care is abstract, delayed, or invisible. The similarity is not metaphorical. It is structural. The same nervous system is responding to the same condition under a different name. Being born helpless explains why humans struggle when asked to carry complexity alone. It explains why self-reliance has limits, and it explains why environments that restore visible structure, rhythm, and shared responsibility feel disproportionately calming. They do not add something new, they return something old that the system recognizes as safety. When all of these pressures converge, the modern human condition reveals itself not as a failure to adapt, but as the final expression of a design that never expected to stand alone. The helpless infant did not survive by becoming strong quickly. It survived because the environment absorbed responsibility until the nervous system could slowly internalize structure. Modern life reverses that flow. It removes visible containment while increasing abstract demand, leaving the same nervous system to bridge the gap by itself. This gap is where chronic strain lives. The mind keeps working because it learned long ago that stopping meant risk. Rest was only possible when someone else was watching. That rule was never rewritten. Intelligence expanded capacity, but it did not replace the original requirement for shared regulation. This is why modern solutions that focus only on individual resilience rarely work. They ask the system to do what it was never designed to do alone. The central question reaches its clearest answer here. Humans are born helpless because their survival strategy depends on external structure during the most critical phases of development. That dependency does not vanish. It becomes embedded. When adult life strips away structure without replacing it, the original vulnerability returns, not as physical helplessness, but as mental overload. This is not degeneration. It is exposure. The same openness that allowed humans to absorb language, culture, and abstract systems now absorbs uncertainty, pressure, and endless possibility. The system does not break. It carries, and carrying without containment is exhausting. Other species are spared this because they close development early and rely on instinct. Humans remain open because openness was the condition that made them human. The helpless beginning was not a mistake. It was the price of building a mind that could hold the world. But that price continues to be paid whenever the world becomes too large to be held alone. What looks like weakness in the modern human is often the echo of the same design that once kept infants alive. A species that began life unable to survive without others never fully learned how to regulate without them. And so, even at the height of autonomy, the nervous system still waits for the signal that someone, somewhere, is holding the edge. Because every layer of the story keeps circling back to the same origin. Humans are not born helpless by accident, and they are not meant to outgrow that helplessness completely. What changes over time is not the condition itself, but the form it takes. The infant depends on physical care, the child depends on guidance, the adult depends on systems, meaning, and coherence. Each stage replaces one kind of dependence with another, but none of them eliminate it. This continuity reveals something uncomfortable about the human story. Strength was never the foundation. Independence was never the starting point. The species did not rise by becoming self-sufficient early, but by remaining unfinished long enough to be shaped. That shaping required others. It required patience, repetition, and shared responsibility. From the first moment of life, survival was conditional, not guaranteed by the body alone. When humans imagine evolution, they often picture a climb toward autonomy, toward mastery over the environment and the self. But the actual trajectory looks different. Humans climbed by leaning. They advanced by distributing survival across relationships, rather than consolidating it inside the individual. Being born helpless forced this distribution from the very beginning. It ensured that no human could exist outside a network for long. Isolation was never an option. Even now, it rarely is. This reframes the entire question. Humans are born helpless compared to other species because their survival strategy is not contained within the individual organism. It is contained within the group. Other species load survival tools into the body before birth. Humans load them into time, culture, and shared memory after birth. That choice delays readiness, but multiplies possibility. It allows learning to replace instinct and coordination, to replace speed. But it also ensures that vulnerability is never fully left behind. The same openness that makes humans adaptable also makes them sensitive. The same dependence that saves infants shapes adults who are deeply affected by disorder, abandonment, and fragmentation. The beginning explains the whole arc. A species that starts life unable to survive alone does not later become a species that thrives alone. It becomes a species that survives through connection and suffers when connection weakens. The helpless newborn is not an early inconvenience. It is the blueprint. Once this blueprint is accepted, the question shifts from confusion to clarity. Humans are born helpless because helplessness forces connection before choice ever appears. A newborn cannot opt out of dependence. And that lack of choice is precisely what stabilizes development. Survival is guaranteed only through others, which means the brain grows inside relationships rather than apart from them. This is not a sentimental idea. It is a structural one. The nervous system calibrates itself against presence, rhythm, and response. Without those, it does not mature correctly. Other species avoid this risk by arriving ready. Humans accept the risk because what they gain later cannot be installed at birth. Language, culture, moral reasoning, and shared imagination require a brain that stays open long enough to absorb them. That openness demands protection. Helplessness is the enforcement mechanism. It prevents premature independence that would close development too early. This explains why human progress looks slow at the beginning and explosive later. The early years are not about performance. They are about construction. The payoff is range. And that payoff only appears if the environment holds the individual long enough for construction to finish. This directly answers the central question again. Humans are born helpless compared to other species because their defining tools are not physical or instinctive. They are relational and cumulative. They cannot function without time and transmission. A body that arrived ready would foreclose those possibilities. Helplessness keeps the system open. But openness never fully disappears. Even in adulthood, humans continue to rely on shared frameworks to stabilize meaning and behavior. When those frameworks fracture, the original vulnerability resurfaces, not because development failed, but because it succeeded exactly as designed. A mind built through connection remains sensitive to disconnection. This is why human suffering often follows social breakdown rather than physical threat. The design that saved infants still governs adults. The beginning never stops mattering. The helpless start is not something humans leave behind. It is something they carry forward in transformed form, shaping how they seek safety, purpose, and coherence long after the body appears strong. When everything is reduced to its simplest form, the answer becomes almost quiet. Humans are born helpless, because helplessness is the condition that keeps the human system open long enough to become what it is. Other species protect survival by closing development early. Humans protect possibility by delaying closure. That delay requires care. Care requires connection. Connection becomes structure. Structure becomes culture. Nothing in this chain works without the first link. The helpless infant is that link. Without it, the brain would close too soon, instincts would harden too early, and the range that defines human life would never appear. This is why the question does not end with birth. It echoes forward into everything humans struggle with later. A system built through reliance never fully escapes reliance. It changes shape, becoming emotional, social, and symbolic. But it remains necessary. When those supports are present, humans function remarkably well. When they fracture, the original exposure returns. This does not mean humans are defective. It means they are consistent. The same design that made language, cooperation, and imagination possible also ensured that isolation, disorder, and overload would hurt more deeply. Being born helpless was the entry cost. Everything else followed from that. The species did not rise above its weakness. It built itself around it, and because of that, human strength has always depended on how well the world around it holds together. At this point, there is nothing left to solve, nothing left to figure out, and nothing left to carry forward, because the question has already done its work. The mind has traced the path from the helpless beginning to the complex present, and it no longer needs to hold the pieces apart. Everything belongs to the same shape. Humans were not born helpless by mistake, and they do not struggle later by accident. The same design runs through the entire arc, quietly and consistently. A body that could not survive alone gave rise to a mind that never learned to close itself completely. That openness allowed learning, connection, and meaning to grow. But it also required constant holding. When that holding is present, the system rests. When it is absent, the system stays awake. There is no need to judge this or fix it. It is simply how the system works. The nervous system does not need to be pushed into rest. It needs permission. Permission arrives when nothing more is demanded, when no decision is required, when no outcome depends on the next thought. Right now, there is nothing left to anticipate. The edges are held. The story has reached its natural slowing point. You do not need to remember every detail or keep the reasoning active. The mind can loosen its grip because the pattern has already been seen. Being born helpless was the beginning of a long process of being carried, shaped, and guided. Even now, the same process continues in quieter forms. Support does not have to be visible to be present. Structure does not have to be named to exist. The body knows when it is no longer required to stay alert. Breathing deepens without effort. Thoughts lose their urgency. The system recognizes that it does not have to stay open anymore. It can settle. It can drift. The question has been answered as much as it ever needed to be. What remains is not understanding, but release. There is nothing left that needs to be added, because the movement of the story has already slowed on its own. The mind does not need a conclusion to rest. It needs the absence of pressure. The beginning, the middle, and the present have folded back into the same place. The system can stop searching for the next connection, because there is no next task waiting. The helpless beginning did not lead to a problem that must be solved. It led to a pattern that can be acknowledged and then set down. It asked for time, holding, and patience, and those things have already done their work. The nervous system can recognize when the work is finished. The body does not need instruction to rest. It only needs the sense that nothing is required of it right now. There is no decision to make, no responsibility to manage, no future that must be rehearsed. The openness that once kept the system awake can now close gently, not because it is forced to, but because it is allowed to. The same design that stayed alert in uncertainty can also release when certainty is no longer demanded. The mind can let thoughts pass without following them. They do not need to be completed. They can fade on their own. Breathing becomes slower without intention. Muscles release tension they were not aware of holding. Awareness widens and then grows quiet. The question that carried the story has already returned to where it began, and it no longer needs attention. Humans were born helpless, and because of that, they learned how to be held. That knowledge does not disappear. It remains available even now, in the simple act of letting go. Nothing will be lost by resting. Nothing important depends on staying awake. The system can power down without fear. The edges are stable. The moment is contained. The mind can drift without direction. And as it does, there is no need to carry the story any further, because it has already reached the place where effort ends.